Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast, where I look to distill the best practices and best ideas of the world's most successful families and their family offices. I hope to provide thought-provoking opinions and feature amazing thought leaders to our listeners of the podcast with an eye towards the future of the family office. Today's podcast is Becoming a Global Citizen, Dual Nationality, and Tax Flexibility. Our special guest is David Lesperance, attorney, JD, at Lesperance and Associates. David is a Canadian, although he may be in a different country as we're talking. We'll find that out as soon as we talk to him. And to give a little bit of context to the dialogue, we're in the midst of COVID-19. There's multiple dynamics at play for families with resources. In the US, getting away from really where the COVID-19 is most impactful, the area that I'm calling you from, New York City, Detroit, New Orleans, San Francisco, potentially going to more remote areas, perhaps even for some of you, underground bunkers. But other challenges include really post the crisis, the ever-growing federal debt by trillions and trillions and trillions and more trillions to come, trust me, that will inevitably potentially lead to runaway inflation. We hope not, but that just may be the consequence of what we're heading to, and for sure, higher taxes. And in general, this has been building up for a while now. There is a backlash, so-called the haves and have-nots, and a little bit of a backlash in general against the wealthy. We all understand that many of us come from humble beginnings. Many of us founded and created companies and employ people and pay more than our fair share of taxes. But nonetheless, there is a dichotomy playing out that we hear it with some of the politicians that are no longer in play, but basically it's almost a negative. It's not looked at as a positive that you created wealth and success. It almost looks like, you need to give more and more and more of it, to the government and to causes, which is one of the great things that families of wealth do is practically all of them that I know are amazing charitable and philanthropists. Now, yes, causes that are going to be important to them, but that's a decision that they make. The best time to plan for optionality is before a crisis. So some families are considering what happens with a future pandemic, so-called an escape plan, or maybe a better word, optionality. And henceforth, that brings us again to David Lesperance, our special guest. David, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Well, we're going through unprecedented government spending, and this is your words, David's words, unprecedented government spending, which could well turn into a ratchet up of entitlements needed to be paid by someone. And that someone, or America's, or really the world's wealthy families, whether it's excessive future taxation, impinging upon your family's wealth and ability to engage in strategic philanthropy, and our general societal scapegoating of the rich, that now is the time to potentially prepare for a wildfire. That's a pretty strong statement that you made. Why did you make that?
Well, there's always been different concerns that my clients have had. And just to step back for a moment, I did my first American client over 30 years ago and have assisted them in both renouncing citizenship or moving out. But for many families, it's really giving themselves the option to vote with their feet if they, in their own determination, feel that's appropriate. One of the things that is really under attack, and this was, I guess, encapsulated nicely in the controversy between Leon Cooperman and Senator Warren, which, she was talking about billionaire tiers, and Leon Cooperman was really saying, this is a fight over the control of strategic philanthropy. Here's a man who has paid an enormous amount of tax in his life. He has set aside some money for his children, but he's really devoting the latter part of his life to causes that he feels are appropriate. And those are societal ills, whether they be local or regional or state or national or even international. And he feels that his efforts are both instantaneous, effective, and efficient, and feels that if more money is put through to the government, that they will not be as effective, efficient, and even relevant to dealing with those social ills.
Well, it's very weird that you brought that up, David. This is an amazing coincidence. Those of you live, I don't think there was anyone that was there, but my last event that I hosted pre-COVID-19, probably about a week before kind of things got really hairy, about 5-6 weeks ago, I hosted an event at a private home for my members, about 25 of them in Palm Beach, a beautiful home. And guess who was our featured guest? And I swear I'm not making this up. It was Leon Cooperman. So Leon Cooperman is one of the most iconic financiers, hedge fund managers ever. He's highly successful, a billionaire. And by the way, he leans towards, he's definitely a Democrat, and he probably leans often to more liberal causes. But he did bring up some issues relative to Elizabeth Warren that you brought up, that basically talking about there was some potential of taxing the rich up to like 80-90%. And again, people that create businesses employ sometimes hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. Imagine all the taxes, all the wealth that's created and being spent, the value that they're providing. And to think that you could be in a country where the taxes could be so onerous, it's almost not worth it to, God forbid, dream big and become highly successful. So he was amazing, talking about the stock market and talking about it from a political and a tax perspective. Let's talk a little bit about, if a family is even thinking about some of these topics, what is their first thing that they should potentially look at? I'm assuming it's to explore opportunities for a passport and potentially dual citizenship. Where do they begin, and what region of the world do they look at?
Well, what they should first look at is, what is their cost of failure should they do nothing? That then gives them a benchmark. So if, for example, the Democrats hit a grand slam in November, you're looking at a minimum of capital gains increasing to ordinary tax rates. It's a long time till November. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of, as you mentioned, backlash. So we may see even more. But if we establish that as kind of the baseline of that's the cost of doing nothing, or the cost of a wildfire. And when you're facing with the potential of a wildfire, you look at what are the three things that you would normally do. One is fire prevention. So you look at what types of strategies, such as tax loss harvesting, et cetera, that you can do now. The second thing is you get insurance. It doesn't mean that you hope to have a fire. You just want to have insurance. And you also want to have what I call a fire escape plan, which is, if the wildfire comes and if the prevention methods are not sufficient, where are you going to go? And that really involves getting alternate residences and alternate citizenships. And one of the things, and really arming your family with the option to vote with their feet. And one of the things that in the 30 odd years, and I've done literally hundreds of these, I think only once have I had more than one family member actually leave. The person that leaves takes and protects the family well, but you can organize this in such a manner that it's not really a big emotional loss for the client, or emotional decision for them to make. And when they're faced with knowing what the financial cost is, what the hard number is, it then allows them to put the soft issues in perspective. And one of the things that you mentioned was the ability to visit family in the United States, or do business in the United States, or go to weddings in the United States. Or I had one client say, or skate at Rockefeller Center. The problem is not getting back in. In those 30 years, I've never had a client who's been refused entry. The problem is self-regulating yourself afterwards so that you don't spend too much time in the United States and again acquire tax status under the substantial presence test. So it's almost like Homeland Security is saying, come on in, and the IRS is saying, and we hope you stay too long.
So a family does the earliest stages of exploring their current situation, their tax picture, making some strategic decisions. I'm assuming, of course, they have a passport. They explore opportunities in countries that potentially initially for dual citizenship could be favorable. Could you give us an idea of some countries right now for an American, a current American citizen that may be attractive from a variety of perspectives, from a cultural perspective, and certainly from a business and tax perspective?
So the first step, because the United States is unique in having citizenship-based taxation, you must have another citizenship in place. Eduardo Savran, for example, already had his Brazilian citizenship from birth. The first thing that we do is look at the family and the family history. The United States is an immigrant country. There is an extraordinary number of first and second generation immigrants that we find when we're looking at families and principal applicants, their spouses, and other family members. And that may be a road to an excellent citizenship. Another pathway is 40% of the Forbes 400 list is Jewish, for example. They can make aliyah, and we do a lot of those types of, doesn't mean you need to go and live in Israel, but that is the tool you must have in your toolbox in order to leave. There's a lot of press and a lot of examination of citizenship by investments, and those are countries which have said, in lieu of a naturalization period, you'll make an investment or do some type of government donation, and those we get to after we've eliminated the other options. That's the citizenship, which may or may not be where you actually go and live. And the places that clients live, Angela, tend not to be places like Cayman or what are thought of as small traditional tax havens, but actually what most people would consider or think of as high tax countries. But because of either tax regimes or tax planning or special deals, they can actually be low or zero tax countries on an ongoing basis. One of the most surprising ones is Canada. Canada does not have a gift tax. It does not have an estate tax. It does not have a wealth tax. Canada does tax worldwide income and capital gains unless you do pre-immigration tax planning. And with some tax planning, you can either eliminate the taxation on your non-Canadian income and capital gain or reduce it to half. Well, that looks pretty good when you compare that to the cost of damage that you're looking at in the United States. Other places such as New Zealand, which gets a lot of press, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Malta, they have what are called remittance basis taxation, which is why you see so many wealthy people in London, for example, is the UK only taxes them on the current year's income that they remit to themselves in the UK. Well, of course, they live off capital. And then there are other jurisdictions such as Switzerland, which have a flat sum, what's called a forfait fiscal regime. So there are a lot of different countries, and part of the process after we've figured out what citizenship we're going to get for the person is really figuring out what alternative residence or residences they can have in their back pocket, which not only makes sense from a numerical point of view. I like to say, not only do you sell it at the boardroom table, but you also sell it at the breakfast table, because you may have family members that want to, that need to kind of buy into the planning that you're going to do.
Well, and just building a little bit upon what you said, just in case there's those that may be listening in, less so live, but more so in my podcast or YouTube, understand that the U.S. IRS, the tax system, is incredibly onerous. You're a U.S. citizen, it's going to follow you anywhere in the world. That's not to say that there's not certain tax strategies you could do, and even setting up offshore entities that may have a little bit of tax benefit, although mainly that's going to be from an asset protection benefit. But most other countries, like you just said, including many that you noted, it's not like they're so great as pure tax havens, but their structure not being as onerous as the US with the IRS means that you could be a citizen there. And again, it's a little more complicated than what I'm probably making it out to be, but you could have assets and resources in different domiciles and earnings in different domiciles that don't come into that country per se. And they just make it easier to have a much, much better tax picture than for a US citizen. I would be remiss in mentioning, and I've covered this topic years ago in one of my podcasts, that there is one strategy that does allow you to be a US citizen, remain a US citizen, and potentially get amazing tax benefits. And you probably know the direction I'm heading, that's moving to either Puerto Rico or the US Virgin Islands. But Puerto Rico is deemed to be the one that is kind of won out, so to speak, relative to the US Virgin Islands for a variety of different reasons. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So in Puerto Rico, they have Act 20 and Act 22, which allow you to greatly reduce your federal tax liability. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, so you don't have to give up your citizenship in order to do that. But you do have to spend more than 6 months of the year in Puerto Rico, which is a choice that people make, a little harder choice to make post hurricanes and earthquakes. The real big issue in actually executing any of these plans, whether that's moving from New York to Palm Beach, or New York to Palm Beach, or to Puerto Rico, or to Toronto, or London, or Auckland, is really overcoming what I call life inertia. And that's really, if you're going to move from New York to Palm Beach, it's more than simply buying a property in Florida. You have to make certain lifestyle changes and limit your time in New York. If you're going to be doing that, and I've managed to, I think I mentioned, Angelo, I'm the third of four children. My older two siblings, which was quite common in the day, are dual US Canadian citizens. Mom would run over to Henry Ford Hospital. I grew up in the Windsor, Detroit area, and they'd come home as dual citizens. By the time they got to number three, my parents were blood incompatible, so her doctor said, don't be going across to the States, you have that child in Canada. So for the simple fact that my parents had incompatible blood is the reason I'm not an American. And I've managed to live my entire life quite nicely, thank you very much, without an American passport. So if you've got another citizenship in place and you've got a life available, and you, as I mentioned before, you can get into the United States for extended periods of time, 4 or 5 months, then life doesn't change all that much, and you reap a lot of benefits. If you want to reap the Puerto Rico or USVI options, you have to actually spend a lot of time in Puerto Rico or the US Virgin Islands. So it is for some people, but I find that for the clients, the biggest hurdle is overcoming the life inertia from where they're at. Once they are prepared to do that, then the world is their oyster.
I mean, let's be honest in terms of how it usually plays out. Families of great wealth want to mitigate their taxes as much as possible. They likely do find the IRS and the US government to be a little onerous from multiple perspectives. And it must be interesting to, drift in your mind about New Zealand, about Poland, about the Cayman Islands, or whatever it may be, and look at all the money and taxes I'm going to be saving. But in reality, when you look at spousal issues, children, grandchildren, and just simply a sense of nationality, that the 4th of July, apple pie, the flag, and I'm thinking of myself. And I'm someone who's sensitive to taxes, but I don't necessarily see me just getting up and moving only to save money on taxes. I have an emotional bond, as well as likely my family. Let's assume children and grandchildren are probably not all going to follow me. So it sounds interesting to listen to it, and I want to learn more about it, but I'm assuming the vast majority of people don't move forward with it.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, if we've got a whole family unit, the entire family doesn't have to make the decision. And I understand. I grew up watching Tiger baseball. I watched American news. I know the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. I know that I can probably read most of the Bill of Rights off the top of my head. I know the emotional attachment. And what happens, as I said, in almost all of the cases, except for one in those 3 decades, is only one family member actually gave up their US citizenship. Doesn't mean that they stop thinking of themselves mentally as an American. It's just that they no longer fit the tax definition of being a US person for tax purposes. And they managed to save a substantial amount of money for the family wealth. But what is very common right now is people don't know what the future is. None of us do. And so they're looking at, as you mentioned in your opening, optionality. They want to give themselves all of the options because they, quite frankly, don't know what's going to happen on the morning of November 4th. They don't know what's going to happen in the midterms. They don't know. And the changes and what you're doing in what we call backup planning, these are changes that will have obviously profound effect, not just on this person's life, but on future generations. If I think back in my own case, in the 1600s, when my ancestor decided to move from France to Canada, that had not only a profound effect on his life, but also on the subsequent generations, including mine. Likewise, for example, you alluded to earlier that I'm not in Canada or the United States. I'm actually in Poland right now with my Polish wife. She's lived in London and Dubai. I lived in Hong Kong and the UK and Canada. We've lived everywhere. We have 2 young children. We wanted to live in Poland first because it was the first grandchildren for my in-laws and to give them a grounding in Polish language, but we'll probably live in a number of other places. Emotionally, they can really live that life. And now, if you're, with television, YouTube, the globalization of things, if you're addicted to Sam Cola, you can get that in 25 different countries. If you want to watch Atlanta Braves baseball, you can get that. If you wanted to watch, your favorite newscast, you can watch that. You can actually very much mentally live in the same space as you always did as an American, but you won't have the tax liability. And that's the mental leap that a lot of people are making. And many people never will get there, but they're at least giving themselves an option. It's, as I mentioned, when you get fire insurance, you don't hope you have a fire. You just realize that if it starts approaching and you feel uncomfortable, you've got yourself the option of leaving.
So I'm exploring options, say, looking at it from the perspective of a wealthy wealth creator or family. I'm Europe, New Zealand, the Caribbean, any one of a number of different countries. And like you said, you're not married only to stay there, including likely being able to come back per family visits and some business interest that you may have in the US. So first step is perhaps making a decision which country you want to have dual citizenship and what are those options? Is it based on my heritage and that's going to help me? Is it based on making a specific investment? We're going to get to that in a second. But because of the onerous reach of the IRS and the government, having dual citizenship is not going to stop if you're also a US citizen, the taxation. So you would have to renounce your citizenship. What is a little bit of that process and how long of a tail does the IRS have relative to following you around the world taxing your income?
They used to have what was called a 10-year rule. They got rid of that. And now they have an exit tax if you meet certain thresholds, which are actually quite low, $2 million in worldwide assets, or 168 million or 168,000 in average tax paid over the last 5 years. If you meet either of those thresholds, you are what's called a covered expatriate, which means that when you leave the US tax system, you have a deemed disposition for tax purposes. And part of the process that we look at in developing a fire escape plan is, how do we deal with that, what's called an exit tax event, but it's a deemed disposition for capital gains purposes. Well, part of our fire prevention, if you think capital gains are going to increase substantially, is pay your capital gains right now, and you may not necessarily write a check. You can do deferrals, you can do loans. There's a number of different strategies. If you've got closely held companies, there's a number of opportunities that you can take with regards to discounting. Interestingly, in the first part of 2009, when the market was suppressed, we had a big upsurge in expatriation because people said, I have good stuff, but the market is pushing everything down right now. I will leave, pay a capital gains at a lower valuation, and I'll enjoy the ride back up in value free of US taxation. Well, we've got a similar phenomena right now. And so part of the planning in the fire escape plan is, we need to get another citizenship in place. What's the best one? Timely, offices open, offices closed. What are the alternate residences that we can get that the family will live on, that are the cheapest, fastest, don't have a physical presence or a tax burden in order to kind of hold those cards in your hand. And if you were to leave, and this is one of the things we're doing right now, is developing for clients literally a plan where when they wake up on November 4th, they can execute the plan and be out before the inauguration. So what would be involved would be, the biggest part is doing a lot of the planning and financial planning and maneuvering that we would do to dealing with the exit plan. The actual renunciation is involved appearing at a US embassy or consulate. You can do this at any one of the US embassies or consulates. So we look at the ones that aren't backlogged. You get an appointment, we prepare you all the paperwork, we prepare you for that appointment. You walk in, you renounce your citizenship, you pay a fee. It's $2,350. And as of that moment, you cease to be a US citizen, you cease to be a US person for tax purposes. So we call that pulling the trigger. We want to make sure that we've got the bulletproof vest on before we do that final act. And we walk people through those. And some people may not do that before the inauguration. They may do it only after, a bill is introduced that they feel that's the straw that breaks our camel's back. They may never do it, but at least they've got themselves the option to what I call vote with their feet.
Let's explore giving an example, perhaps in a country. So you mentioned one country that is probably not necessarily the best from a tax perspective per se, but for language, for physical beauty. It seems like New Zealand right now is like super hot. It's relatively not overly densely populated. If you feel we could be subject to future pandemics, it appears to be a good option from that perspective. You're isolated, which is both a little bit good and bad. Again, there are some people learning during the self-isolation that they're probably more social beings than they thought. And now after 4 or 5 weeks of this, they're like, well, I thought I could just grow a beard for 5 weeks and go on an island and live there forever. And maybe that's not such a good idea. So I'm also hearing a little blowback on that. But how about countries like New Zealand that are like, hold on here. We got too many wealthy foreigners, if there is such a thing, looking to come to our country to buy real estate. They're jacking up the prices. They're looking to become citizens, but they're looking to be very tax sensitive. Are you hearing backlash from native citizens of those countries with their political leaders not liking that? And is that going to be a growing trend around the world?
Well, I think one of the things is you use the word backlash. I think we are going to see that generally across the world, whether in the developed or undeveloped world. So the idea is what will be the rules in New Zealand 5 years from now with regards to immigration? I don't know. I couldn't tell you what they'll be in any country in 5 years. So that's why we would want to get, and New Zealand is interesting in that they do have an investor option. You can get a residence permit, which does not require any time. You can get it and hold that card in your hand, doesn't require any physical time some countries do, to maintain that status. Unless you pick up and move to New Zealand, you're not a tax resident, so there's no tax cost to holding that card in your hand. New Zealand is an interesting jurisdiction from a tax point of view. They have no capital gains. Jakarta Ardern came in talking about a capital gain, and then once she got up into the big kids chair, realized no, that's probably not a good thing. Wasn't because of the foreigners. The natives were saying no, we don't want capital gains. We're gains tax coming in. And pre-immigration, there's the deals with income tax. There's no estate tax. So again, it's a good jurisdiction. Is New Zealand right for you? I happen to really like New Zealand, but it's a little isolated for me. I have other clients who love the place. The idea is to make sure that your family's plan with the alternate residence or residences is going to fit your family's needs, your family's preferences. Some people want to live in New Zealand. Some people want to live in New York City. Some people want to live in Wyoming. Some people want to live in Wales. It's very much a personalized preference, and you need to make sure that your backup plan is livable for those who have to live it.
It just popped in my head. It probably is a little bit of a stretch, but have you come across situations where a wealthy wealth creator who's older and does feel a sense of nationalism to their country, and although maybe frustrated with certain political and tax situations, is still going to end up sticking it out, but they have adult age children that are coming into more resources, that maybe they've been gifting assets as a estate tax plan, and that older children in their 30s, 40s, or perhaps even older may be the one who would be the better person or family unit, assuming they're interested, to make the decision that you are. Have you seen kind of in-depth intra-family planning from that perspective?
Quite often, actually, we'll have a parent, an older person who, whether it's moving from New York to Florida, they just aren't able to bring themselves to overcome that life inertia that we talked about. And that may be simply moving from a familiar area all the way to giving up their citizenship. You have then next generation or generations who are saying, well, I went to school in the UK. I don't have a problem with that. I I work with and constantly deal with people who are not American, and they all seem to be doing quite fine. And so they are more emotionally ready to do that. And again, as I mentioned, it's usually only one family member in the group, and it may be 2 or 3, some cases 4 generations, they're the ones ready to do that. And with some planning ahead of time, you can have a large part of that escape the burden of U.S. tax. If you look at Eduardo Savern, he renounced his citizenship when he was in his 30s. He's probably got 40 plus more years of income and capital gain growth in front of him. He's not going to have the burden of U.S. tax on that. He can invest in the United States. He can come and visit the United States. He can follow U.S. sports teams and even go to the March Madness when they have it. And so he can effectively do all of those things. And a lot of it is looking at the world, not just as the United States, what does the US offer, but what do all other jurisdictions offer? And can I arbitrage and take advantage of the things I like? And can I avoid the things I don't like, whether that's excessive taxation or particular lifestyle or political or social unrest? Um, this is part of the planning that we do, because I deal not only with American families, I deal a lot with Asian families and Middle East families, a lot of international families in the United Kingdom. You know, they have other concerns than simply taxation that are on their list of risk factors.
Which actually brings me to my next comment question. And part of this is shaped by one of the live audience members listening in that is asking a question that I'm going to tweak somewhat. First of all, from what I'm seeing, a little bit of a reverse is we have wealthy families around the world looking to be sometime, and now it's a little more challenging, and not just because COVID-19, I mean mainly from a governmental perspective, but looking at the US as being a safe haven. Let me own assets here. Let me own real estate here. My country was stable 10 years ago, and now it's not. So we bitch and moan about the challenges that we have here in the US. We'd like to hope that we have relatively a stable government and economy, although COVID-19 and the growing deficit is putting a challenge to that. But for those looking from the outside looking in, the US could be, and comparative to certain tax rates in other countries, often in Europe, could be relatively attractive. But that wasn't really the core point of the question. The core point of the question from the person who sent the chat feature question in was more than just a financial decision, but how about a stability of government and preferable society compared to what we're having here in the US? And that probably is where New Zealand, to some, does look attractive. So talk a little bit about, I'm not just making the decision from a purely financial perspective. I just simply like the direction of government and society in a different country, and I don't like the direction that it's headed here.
Well, and that's part of the mix as to what is the appropriate residence and citizenship. And I just completed a white paper that kind of goes through all of this decision-making process. But to give you an example, the United States is popular. Right now, I have a lot of ultra-high net worth Mexican families. In Mexico, you've got President AMLO, who is there, who's a former socialist mayor of Mexico City, who's basically done a couple of things that really have scared ultra-high net worth families. The first thing he did last fall was he expanded upon rules that were originally created to deal with drug cartels, making that he now applied to what they're called tax fraud, which is anything they accuse you of more than 400,000 US in tax fraud. And that allows extraordinary seizure, it allows extraordinary jailing, etc. And to quote one Price Waterhouse accountant, if you were to design an extortion tool, you couldn't have done better. Well, when the COVID pandemic came out, first he denied its existence. He was going out in crowds and telling everybody to, come to his rallies and go to restaurants. And when one of the aides was asked, aren't you worried, because he's an older gentleman, about him getting? And they said, well, he's pure of heart. Okay, and now he's pitting the poor against the wealthy and building up on that backlash. So ultra high net worth Mexican families, of course, are very familiar with the United States. They have homes in the United States. They have businesses, investments. Their children went to school. And so for those families, we build a backup plan that includes the United States. Now, for the child who's going to, Stanford or MIT, they can become resident aliens, which is one of the tax statuses. If you're a citizen, resident alien, or you spend too much time physically in the United States, you're a U.S. person for tax purposes. Well, we'll let my son and my daughter become a U.S. person for tax purposes. They don't have any of the money. But the person who does, they want access to the United States, but they don't want the tax liability. So in that case, we do things like E2s, L1s, TN visas, O visas, all non-immigrant visas. We tend to stay away from the EB5 visas
Right.
for a couple of reasons, because there is a long backlog. The other is the end result is green card status, i.e. tax status. So they want access to the United States. We'll let other family members who we're not subjecting the family wealth to U.S. taxation to become U.S. green card holders and even citizens in due course. But we are going to keep we're going to have preferred access. We're not going to simply be visitors, but we're not going to have the tax status. So they're going to be like that expatriated American, which is the Homeland Security saying, come on in, and the IRS is saying, and we hope you stay too long. And then we get very sophisticated. For example, we may also get them an alternate residence in Canada. Again, they don't become resident in Canada for tax purposes. But what that does is it allows them to have additional days in the United States without attracting the substantial presence test, because they're only counting days. Well, you don't count the day that you commute from Canada to work in the United States at your L1 visa that we set up. So there's a lot of sophisticated planning that we do, and a lot of people do want access to the United States, whether that's for business or lifestyle or investment purposes. But we want to do that in a way that's not going to capture them to that U.S. worldwide taxation net.
Staying on that theme somewhat, I suppose the perception maybe inside and outside of the U.S. is kind of what I said. The U.S. is incredibly stable. It has strength in government, in resources, in stability. And looking at it from maybe an arch libertarian perspective, yeah, the grass may look greener from a tax perspective in a different country, and maybe it looks good from a societal perspective now, but that country likely doesn't have the stability and military might of the United States. It is subject to other countries. I hate to sound negative, but invading. It's subject to a form of tremendous government corruption, which has happened in many LATAM countries. So like, what happens when you do all this? You go to a country that appears to offer you better tax benefits or may look better from a societal perspective. And then 10 years later, you know, it's run by a fascist. They're confiscating your money. They're putting you in jail. The society isn't what you thought it was going to be. And you're like, oh God, I wish I just stayed in the US.
Well, you have to think of this in the same way that you invest. You don't invest in a single stock. It may look great today, but you don't have no idea what it'll be in 10 years. You diversify. That's why you have alternate residences. That's why you monitor all these things. And really, if I look at even my own life, what I do is, and I would consider myself libertarian, is I look at what are all. I'm not going to change the system in any given country with my single vote, but I can, by organizing my life, take advantage of those parts of, if I want to invest in the US market, I can do so. If I want to do something in the UK, I can do so. If I want medical coverage in Harley Street or the Mayo Clinic or a Thai medical, I can do so. So I can, if I organize my life properly, I can avoid things like extraordinary taxation on my global income while taking advantage of those things, whether they be education or medical, stability, rule of law. If contract law, I can choose to have arbitration in Hong Kong if I wanted to. And so it's really understanding that if I want to have access to the US market, if I want my children to go to Disney World, I don't have to subject myself to worldwide taxation of that jurisdiction to get advantages of that jurisdiction that I want. And again, I have no idea, nobody does, what the world will look like if we think of what the world was a year ago, let alone 5 or 10 years ago. We are living in interesting times. And, you know, that, and so you want to be able to have the optionality. You want to be able to monitor things, and you want to be able to see those things and have the choices to move and react ahead of time. That's why if you already have a residence in place, if you already have a citizenship in place, if you already have all of the pieces in place, you can have your fire escape plan and execute. I mean, these fire escape plans for one wealthy Silicon Valley client I have, we've got it down to, from the moment he says go until he's no longer a U.S. Person for tax purposes, about 2 to 3 weeks. Well, societies don't fall apart in 2 to 3 weeks, but the wildfire doesn't come in that fast, but you can sure smell the smoke and react, in that period of time.
Yes, and I know my comments probably come across as very, kind of old-fashioned pro-American, but to put on the other hat for a second, yeah, there are things that some people besides global taxation may not like in this country. Don't forget, it does go back a long time ago, but that FDR basically said, hey, if you own gold, you're going to turn it in. We're going to pay you what we think is a fair price. You don't do it, it's a felony. So there are certain controls that the US government could have, quote unquote, on its people, let alone potentially, someone saying, oh, suppose Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders did become president. Would we start to look socialistic very, very quickly? And forget the tax angle, but that's important, but just from a societal perspective. But just so I don't offend my brethren wearing the other political perspective, the other side may feel, well, suppose you get a hardcore Tea Party type candidate, and then we don't like American society from our perspective as a liberal. So it's not really either or political perspective. Whatever it may be, you may again want to have optionality relative to a society or country that you think could be a better fit for you. Now, I could argue that may be a little short-sighted, things change, but again, this is a decision that families are going to have to make on their own.
Well, and you alluded to something which is part of the holistic backup plan. And I'll give an example. In 1990, I had a client from Kuwait. Now, when Saddam invaded, he invaded in August. Kuwait's a pretty hot place in August. So most Kuwaitis were in places like London or Paris or New York. And this fellow was in New York. He happened to have retained my firm to purchase some properties in Toronto and then put some monies into our firm trust account to pay out as they hit construction miles. He called up and said, the US and UK governments have, for my benefit, frozen all my UK and US assets so that I won't be subject to blackmail out my cousin who was left behind, who's now being held by the Iraqis. But the problem is, I have a floor of this hotel for myself, my family, security people, nannies, etc. I don't have a credit card. I don't have cash. Now, we happen to have some money, and Canada didn't follow the UK and the US on that. But that was an important lesson for him, which is not only do you have alternate residences and immigration documents that allow you to get in the airport and to occupy those places, but you want to make sure that you have monies available in order to sustain yourself. I mean, history is replaced with situations where people escaped with $50 in their pocket, who left behind great wealth. Well, that's better than not getting out, but the preference is to plan also that you're going to have your access to your wealth along with sustaining your family well-being.
We're going to take it to a bit of the home stretch soon. And no, this was not a podcast or a YouTube that was meant to be focused on bunkers and setting up, emergency situations. There's a good reason to do a podcast on that. So that is something in the future that we'll have some experts on relative from that perspective to talk about. This is really planning from a perspective of looking at your global options from a society and a tax perspective. and weighing them. And we discussed quite a bit of back and forth. There is one question from the audience. Before I get to that, I would like to hear a little bit of the personal side of your decision to move to Poland. Too cold for me. But obviously, if a spouse from there that somewhat played into it, that may also help with the citizenship angle. What have you found beneficial for you being a Canadian, or at least a former Canadian citizen, and now being in Poland, but knowing that what you said earlier, it may not be your last move?
Right. So I decided there was a couple of reasons to move to Poland. At the same time, there was a couple of reasons to move out of Canada. I'm still a Canadian citizen. Canada doesn't tax based on citizenship. So Canada, in fact, the US is the only country which makes you give up your citizenship. So I became a non-resident in Canada before Mr. Trudeau came into office the first time, because part of his platform was to vow to increase taxes for me. That was one driver out of Canada. Another driver was having our children establish in their first years of their life, establish the language of Poland. Another driver was that, as my mother said, I love your twins, David, but they're number 11 and 12 for me. So these were the first children for my in-laws. Let the in-laws, have the day-to-day interaction. I'll see them on Skype and on visits. So, and there were some business reasons why we came. We came to Poland, and we're now, probably this will be our last year. And then we'll move on to, and we're looking at places like Portugal. We're looking at places with have a lifestyle. We wouldn't move, for example, to Monaco because we like space, we like beaches, we like the educational things for children. That may be right for some people, not necessarily right for us. So we have a number of different choices that we're looking at, and that's not going to be our life decision. That will be for the next chunk of our life cycle, which would be our children really entering school. They'll be 6 at the end of the month, so they're just starting grade school and high school. There will be a time when they totter off to university or do whatever they're going to do, where we may not, where we may move to yet another place. So it's this idea that we're not stuck in one place versus the other. With regards to temperature, Poland, while geographically significantly north, is part of the Gulf Stream. The weather is actually nicer here than it is in New York City or Connecticut, where my wife moved from New York before she married me. And Toronto was certainly, we had snow 2 days on the ground this year. Right now it's quite nice. It's a seaside resort. It's very nice. It also had, it's a federal government. I'm not greatly enamored with the government here, but again, I've organized my life so they have little impact. But when COVID hit, they saw what happened in Italy, and they took steps. And because there's not a provincial or state level or regional level, they were able to do things. And as a result, the per capita rates of COVID are less than 1/10 that they are in Italy or in the United States. So that was a good thing for this period of time. Do I want to stay here forever? No, I've arbitraged, and I'm going to get what the best out of it that I can, and then we'll move on to another situation that fits our family situation, needs, and desires better.
We do have another question that came in. You may end up needing more context, but effectively what it says is about substantial presence. Measured after giving up U.S. citizenship, is it based on days, like 186 days?
So it's what are called counting days. I alluded to before, a day that you commute from Mexico or Canada into the United States for work does not count. What happens is you look at a percentage of 2 years, last year and this year, and it effectively comes out to kind of 120 days. I mean, you have to work the formula a bit. So that day, so I have clients, for example, who live in Toronto, who get up fly from Toronto to New York. It's an hour and 15-minute flight. Work on Wall Street Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Fly out before Friday. They have not accumulated, they've only accumulated 3 days for US and state tax purposes. New York has different rules where they say if you breathe the air for a second in any of the 5 boroughs, congratulations. But when you look at, they've gone from New York City, state, and federal to only New York City tax. It looks pretty good. And if they've organized themselves so they're not paying little to no Canadian tax, then that's a very good arbitrage. The substantial presence test, if you trigger the substantial presence test, that raises the presumption that you are a US person for tax purposes. That's a rebuttable presumption. So part of the planning that we would do, for example, for that Wall Street client, is that we would make them tax resident in Canada. Well, now you've got a tiebreaker rule that allows them to say, well, US, I raise a presumption, but I'm going to rebut the presumption. I'm tax resident in Canada. And if the US says, well, you don't pay very much in Canada, you can say, well, bring that up with the Canadian Parliament. I'm paying everything I'm obligated to pay.
Yeah, very good point. We're pretty much, David, it's been a really good hour of a conversation. If you could tell the audience a little bit about your practice, which we didn't get a chance to get too much into. I'm assuming they're figuring that out from our dialogue, but a brief recap with your practice and how they could learn more about you. You mentioned the white paper, perhaps your website, and ways they could connect with you.
Well, hopefully you'll put it, because it's a long website, hopefully you'll put that up in your website. But our website is Lesperance, LESPERANC Associates, plural.com. So LesperanceAssociates.com. And again, my bio is on there, but basically I grew up in a border city where this was kind of at the breakfast table. As I mentioned, that, you know, siblings were US citizens, father woke up in Canada, worked in the United States. So I kind of grew up with this. As I was going through law school, I happened to work as a Canadian immigration official at the car entry in a Toronto airport. Not that I thought I would do this, it just was a great gig. And then I either saw the light or went to the dark side and got called to the bar in 1990. And I did my first US expatriation in 1990. So the Americans are a big chunk of my clients. Another is my law school study partner went work for Baker McKenzie in Hong Kong. That was the lead up to the 1997 handover. So I've been working for clients in that area now for 3 decades. And at the same time, I was running up and down the Gulf, kind of, you know, if this is Tuesday, must be Bahrain, on behalf of British Bank of Middle East, which was HSBC and Standard Charter, meeting all their private banking clients. So I'm very familiar with Gulf National, non-resident issues. I lived in the UK as what's called a resident non-dom, so very familiar with that. So I have the 3 main practice groups, but I have clients from kind of all over the place. I mentioned Mexico, for example. Before the election of AMLO, I didn't have any Mexican clients. Right now, they're probably the majority of new clients that I have. So things constantly change. I never had French clients, and then they brought in a super tax. Things come and go, as you alluded to, tax policies changes. Saudi clients I had for 3 decades. All of a sudden, when the MBS decided, you know, I'm going to invite some people to the Ritz-Carlton, treat it like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can never check out. Those clients were happy that they had backup plans. You hope the fire never hits you, but you take comfort for yourself and your family. And the other thing of having the backup plan is it's unlike an insurance policy. There are actually benefits that you can have. It's not like the Lesperance children set out to do this, but my older sister married a Latvian, my brother married an Italian, I married a Brit and a Pole, my younger sister married an Irishman. And so I'm the only one of my generation to actually pick up and move, but all my nieces and nephews have all gone to school, worked, lived in Europe. And so it's, as I said, it's that multi-generational benefit that this planning has for everybody.
And what's an email that people could reach you?
David at lesperanceassociates.com.
And everyone, I'm Angelo Robles, host of this Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast and the founder and CEO of Family Office Association. We're a global membership organization dedicated to the interest of families of great success and their single family offices, providing significant amounts of content and hosting a variety of global programs. Now, the physical programs with COVID-19 are on hold, but one day shall return. But as many of you know, we've been active practically daily hosting online meetings, some of them as family office to family office, peer-to-peer only, some of them with great experts like David, who we have today, and many others that have appeared and are appearing in the days and weeks to come. And we also launched an amazing member online private portal for 24/7 global communication and information among our members to share. So it's been an incredibly active and busy time for us in some ways, at least with families in my SFOs, single family offices. I've never been so busy. So reach out to us if you're interested in membership or inquiring. And I'm easy to reach as well. I'm very active on social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. YouTube channel is Family Office, by the way. And I can be reached at familyofficeassociation.com, our website, my personal website, Angelo Robles, Robles.com. And email Angelo at familyofficeassociation.com or Angelo at angelorobles.com. Reach out anytime. David, thanks for being a great guest. Live audience, thanks for listening in live. And everyone that sees it on YouTube or on a podcast, hears it on a podcast, we hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much, everyone.